So John Ehrlichman was one of the henchmen for Richard Nixon. I say henchman because he was one of the organizers of Watergate, and that was proven out. He got convicted and sent to prison for his role in the crimes of Watergate. Now, one of the things he got sent to prison for was conspiracy. Because Watergate was a conspiracy. They planned to break into the Democratic headquarters, steal information about them, basically undermine our democracy, right? Well, it turns out they hatched another conspiracy, which Ehrlichman bragged about back in 1994. He said it to a writer named Dan Baum, and for some reason it has sat in the dustbin of history until this moment. And Harper's Magazine, in this April edition, ran his original quotes from back in '94. Ehrlichman, now out of prison and out of politics, felt, I guess, that he had nothing to lose, so he was going to be honest about why they started the war on drugs. And if you remember, it was Nixon. The Nixon administration started what they called the war on drugs back in 1971. Turns out, it was not because they were concerned that drugs were really dangerous for Americans. It was for attacking their political enemies. Now, again, you might think, like, come on, this sounds conspiratorial. First of all, it's the guy who did the conspiracy who's admitting it. Second of all, he got arrested for and convicted on another conspiracy. It's not like he's shy about conspiracies. And Nixon, third of all, had an enemies list. These are all facts. So now here's Ehrlichman in his own words. He says, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. How do you see that and then not want to immediately end this nonsense political war on drugs? This prohibition that has proven to be disastrous in its effect, but it turns out it was done to be a war on black people and liberals, who they called hippies back then. Now, originally they were trying to use more of the legislation of heroin against blacks, but it turns out later they were like, oh, blacks smoke marijuana just like whites do. Okay, let's arrest them for that. And they arrested them at 4 times the rate of whites, even though they smoke at the same rate. The whole point was to make sure that they could arrest their political enemies. How could you know that and still be in favor of the war on drugs? Well, Ehrlichman goes on. He says, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Now, I'm going to show you how they're still doing that in a second. But when asked about whether he and Dick Nixon intended to do that, he said, quote, did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did. Jesus Christ. Now, there was one other member of that Nixon administration, and he wound up having a fairly large role later in American politics. Let me show you a picture of him. That's right there, Richard Nixon sitting in the White House with Roger Ailes. Now, what does Roger Ailes do now? Oh, he's the head of Fox News. Back then, Roger Ailes wrote this memo, and he gave it to Richard Nixon. Quote, a plan for putting the GOP on TV news. Now, keep in mind that Ehrlichman says night after night on the news, we're going to blame black people for drugs and call them dangerous so we can beat them politically. Now let me show you what Fox News is doing today, night after night, led by Roger Ailes, who was in that same Nixon administration. Now watch.
About race, not drugs. They feel that police departments are corrupt across the nation. They target African-American youth. They try to track them down for having J's on them, and put them in jail because they hate blacks. I mean, that's what it is. And they totally avoid the reality of why arrests in urban America are higher than suburban America. So you know what's going on, Howard. Why don't you just admit it?
But I think that if you start to arrest their children and give them records and put barriers in front of their futures and their careers, I think people say, wait a second, as you said in the previous segment, this is soft drug use. Why are you arresting and giving this kid a record, especially minority kids, disproportionately, they're the ones who get arrested.
Only dealers, Juan. There's no mass arrest of
Bill.
users.
No, users are
No, they get a
arrested.
ticket,
Bill.
Juan. They get a ticket.
I don't think
so
that's
it's like
right, Bill.
speed.
And I think
No, it
lots
is
of
right.
people.
But, you know, the statistics do show that African Americans, almost 4 times as likely to be arrested for possession than whites.
Why is that?
Well, I think it's because too many cops are fulfilling their quotas by going into minority neighborhoods. But
The crime rates in the black urban precincts are off the chart compared to suburbs and rural areas, okay? So the police, by necessity, to protect the poor people there, who are being murdered by the hundreds in Chicago, for example, have to flood the zone. And in flooding the zone, they pull people over and they ask them questions, and if they're obviously high or openly using marijuana, they get arrested. It's not a let's hunt down the black people today.
Oh, they have to flood the zone. It's not like we have the war on drugs to hunt black people down. No, Bill, that's exactly why we have it. And here you are, however many decades later, still doing that same propaganda that Ehrlichman wanted to do, Nixon wanted to do, and a young staffer named Roger Ailes wanted to do, who's now your boss. And there you are on TV telling everybody, no, the blacks are more criminal than the whites in the suburban areas, even though they actually do the crime of smoking pot at the same exact rate. But they get arrested at 4 times the rate. Why? Because that's the whole point of the war on drugs. We have to end it immediately.